Here is Van Diemen's Wasabi. The green here is a perfect match for the name, and it perfectly matches the swatch, but will suffer some of the expected Van Diemen's issues. There is no tone shift as the papers change, and it does occasionally give some shading. Just seeing it, I can taste the wasabi. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it gives feathering and it gets very deep into the page, so tread lightly. But I do enjoy this green and don't have a green of this tone. I think I might really want a bottle just for use on premium papers.
The pen for today is a Cross Bailey. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we can see really the majority of it gives that perfect wasabi green tone. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does have areas that it gets a little bit darker, and that's because usually the pen sits for a couple days before I write. I believe that's the reason some of that happens, or it's just that little bit in between. No feather, no spread, nice shading. Take a look at Solved. I just think it's looking very nice here. Gentle mid-tone S into a slightly darker O, lightening up with the LVE, slightly darker D at the end. Already has some of the same great shading. I'm enjoying what I see here on this bright white paper. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting, no spotting, no Van Diemen's problems here.
Van Diemen's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Diemen's.
Here is Van Diemen's Apricot. Here is Van Diemen's Pepperberry.
Here is Van Diemen's Midnight Sky.
Here is Van Diemen's Sweetheart Cherry.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does have only the tiniest bit of shading. It's doing, I think, generally very well. Looking at the back of the page, you see we have a good paper for this ink as it does not bleed and it does not ghost.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just the tiniest bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. I believe that's a result of the tone of the paper being that it's adding yellow to what's going on in this green, making it brighter, showing it's a little bit more translucent and ink. There is some minor feathering that's going on in a lot of the words. There is some minor spread that's going on in some of the words. It's something to be aware of. It's not so distracting that chart stops being chart. It's just that you definitely see those feathers happening, especially on the H to A. It's not all the time, and it's not a huge major issue, but it is definitely present. The shadings there is very minor. You really kind of have to look for it on this paper, just with the way it's lightened up, but you do see the values change, like in values right here. Looking at the back of the page, we can find a number of spots where it got quite deep into the paper, never bleeding through to touch the page underneath. The ghosting's not really a problem. These spots are just to be aware of them. I see them, I think, easier than on camera. I could be wrong. I would still probably write back here, though.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does offer shading in quite a few spots. Not huge, and you don't have to think too hard to find it. When you look at think right here on the third line, the T is a nice midtone, gets darker into the H. I. The N lightens up quite a bit with a very dark K at the end. Most important, it stands out against this quad rule with no problems whatsoever, allowing the quad rule to melt into the background after you no longer need it. Looking at the back of the page, good paper for this ink with no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks. Here is Noodler's Harold's Hearse. Here is Private Reserve DC Super Show Green.
Here is Sailor Studio 280.
Here is Visconti Green.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
The tone we're getting here is quite a bit lighter than we have on the Clairfontaine, and it feels like a fresher green. It's definitely a bit lighter and fresher as a tone. No feather, no spread, some light shading going on. If you're a student really wanting a green in your notebook, this is a very nice green to use. And it comes with some shading. You can spot it. It's not always there, but look at Problem, where the shading is going on and it's very gentle, opposed to List, where some of the shading is very large in the amount of tone variation we get. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Pilot Fuyugaku Winter Persimmon. Here is Mont Blanc Beetles Psychedelic Purple. Here is Kaweco Pearl Black. Here is Noodler's Chaise Rose.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter than we have on the Clairfontaine. There is some light feathering that goes on, incredibly light, not worth drawing big attention to, just that it's there. The amount of spread that goes on is an expected amount of spread for writing on copy paper. There is even some shading going on, which is very nice. I think this is a great ink to use as an alternative for a grading ink. It's like saying, here's the moneymaker in fixing these problems. Looking at the back of the page, you know, it does get a little deeper at a couple points. On the majority, there's some light ghosting. The dotting, I'm going to even ignore here because it's copy paper. This is a great ink for this paper. I think you could probably get away with writing on both sides.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Cross Bailey has a medium nib that is writing with a medium flow and gives a perfect wasabi green with touches of shading. Off camera, for sake of masochism, I tried a very wet broad, and Trainwreck is just as expected what happened. But what would it be if I didn't try to go with the wrong direction once in a blue moon for an ink? Absolutely the wrong direction choosing that pen here. So it would seem that a medium flow, medium nib is the perfect match for this ink. I cannot see any other way. Enjoy.